Hello and welcome. Well, evolution, by definition, biologically, is defined as, get ready for it, change in the gene pool of a population from generation to generation by such process as mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift. Now, the recent changes in climate change awareness really has increased a global shift towards plant-based diets, which have become identified as critical in helping reduce and preventing climate breakdown. Now, did you know in January of this year, 2021, there was a high profile international scientific journal which had published results from a recent study. And that study showed that vegan diets are continually gaining in popularity, especially among young adults. And through the choices of families who eat vegan diets, of course, are becoming more common in young children too and in households. Now, through this and recent challenges, of course, like COVID, really have brought about, I guess, a shift and a lift and change in consciousness. And one of the many changes included, like with this also, children included, meaning that they are choosing to eat less or no meat and animal products at all. So as we become more sensitive to our environment and of course what it means when we eat animals. However, the choices for families bringing children up in vegetarian or vegan sort of households and diets really have been rife with criticism, which is really what we're here to discuss today with our special guest and of course one of our partners here at Kittypedia. Now we've got Sarah Smith, dietitian from Bayside Dietetics. Just a little bit about our guest. Sarah works in a private practice in Bayside, Melbourne, after working for an extensive period within a Monash Children's Hospital. And she has written a response to a recent study that addresses the dangers of vegan diets for infants and children. So we're really excited to be chatting with her on this topic. Welcome back. How are you?
Thanks, Rachel, for having me. I'm well, thank you, and I'm really excited that Kittypedia has picked up on this and really wanting to get more information for parents out there. So thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always. Now, we know, of course, that children's bodies may have higher nutritional needs whilst they're growing and most definitely require a balanced diet to ensure healthy growth and development. Now, given this, and as I mentioned earlier, there is an ongoing query about the health benefits of children eating less meat or any animal products at all, that being within a vegan diet. So I guess it's understandable and it's common that many people ask the question, is a vegan diet safe for growing children? So just initially, I'd love to know, what are your thoughts?
Such a great question, and I love your introduction. Has picked up on some really key themes with this. That it's much more popular these days amongst adults, and by nature of that, it's more prominent within children. But it does come with some nutrition risks. So we need to find out more about where the balance sits. And to be honest, there's not much research for children. We've got a whole lot of information now on potential health benefits for adults, but as you rightly point out, it's a critical period for growth in children. So are the nutritional risks, how do they weigh up against those potential health benefits? So it's a really nice question, and the study we're going to talk about is one of the first that really looks at this particular age group, and in this study was between 5 and 10 years of age.
Mm. Now, just for the sake of clarity, and before we get into the nitty gritty, by definition, I just wanted to establish the difference between a vegetarian diet and a vegan diet. So that is, a vegan diet excludes all meat and animal products, that being meat, poultry, fish, seafood, dairy, and eggs, where a vegetarian diet excludes meat, poultry, fish, and seafood. Of course, there's a few variations of vegetarian diet that depend on whether you eat or exclude eggs, dairy, and fish. So there is a very fine line, I think, between the two, and there's no really hard and fast rules with this sort of stuff, is there? Or is there? I don't know.
No, good point. I mean, they all have their own little definitions if you get into it, but you're quite right that there's a big spectrum now of different sorts of diets, and people pick their own spot within that spectrum. So there are lots of different ways of doing it for sure.
And overall, then, like, how would you define, I guess, the pros and cons? Because I mean, some of the cons, of course, would be, if a diet really isn't well planned out for a child, and if diets, in some instances, not so much for children, of course, but definitely for adults, and if as we all try to lead by example, so if some diets are quite extreme, there's macrobiotic and fruitarian diets and all kinds of things like that. But
Mm.
is there anything else besides overall the cons that you would sort of which we're going to get into a lot of that, obviously, soon enough. But how would you, on a broad spectrum, sort of address the cons about these diets?
I think the big thing that warrants, so that brings some risk into it and is worthwhile keeping an eye on, is excluding whole food groups. That will, as you talked about, sort of with evolution, the human body has evolved to certainly have had meat included in the diet. So excluding food groups, it's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. However, it needs to be done quite carefully to be able to make sure the nutrients are replaced. So whether that be a food group excluded through vegetarian or vegan choices, or whether it's a food group excluded for a food intolerance or for some other dietary choice. It's
Right.
just making sure that any sort of nutrient that are taken out with the food group is replaced in some other way. And we do know humans actually go quite well with alternative forms of replacement. So things like supplements can actually be quite useful to replace any missing food group.
And so, of course, on the flip side of this, we've got the pros and the benefits. So now some studies have shown that children following vegan diets are more likely to eat consistent with the recommended dietary guidelines, including more fruits and vegetables, which, of course, can help reduce the risk of obesity and possible future chronic diseases. So there is all of, this, as you said, too, there are a lot of replacements for all of those food groups. But, further to this, I guess there are many parents feeding their kids, which I just wanted to raise this topic, on
Mm,
not specifically about veganism, but of course, there's lots of parents feeding their children foods with little nutritional value at all. However, it's assumed that just because their diets include meat and dairy, so possibly going to be filled with more junk food and processed foods, but just because their diets include meat and dairy, there is an assumption that they're actually meeting like nutritional needs, which isn't always the
mm,
case. So I just wanted to
mm,
just, it's a bit of a raw nerve, I think, for a lot of people. But like, what are your thoughts on that topic in general?
mm. No, it's a
Sorry to
really
go
good
there.
question. Listen, I think parents, I meet a whole lot of parents that come in with their children with me, and all parents are doing their very best to feed their children. And I think when you give your child enough to eat, you are doing an amazing job. A lot of parents are interested in getting for their child beyond that into the health benefits, saying, right, what can I do for my child that might help them with their health? Because we do know a lot of health benefits will carry through into adulthood. And so you beautifully picked up on your question there that things like including fruit and vegetables, including unprocessed foods, they're foods that could be part of any sort of diet that will come with some health benefits attached to them.
Mhm. Now, what we're here to discuss today, that there has been a strong media reaction to a recent study that looked into the impact of vegan and vegetarian diets in children, which you addressed in a recent article and we published with the title, A Response to Recent Reports About the Dangers of Vegan for Infants and Children. So for someone who hasn't read the article yet, can you please tell us what it's about and, of course, what inspired you to write it?
This sensational media reports that really I think got a lot of clicks by saying the dangers of vegan eating, vegan children are going to be shorter. It was important to come back and actually give some really nice, more grounded information behind that. So that's what this article basically does. And the study that we're referring to is a study that they did in Poland that was published earlier this year, where they looked at a small group of children, mind you, 187 children, and they grouped them into the three different styles of diets: the vegan diet, the vegetarian diet, and what we'd call the omnivore diet, which is where you include meat and plant products in there. And they looked at the health benefits and the potential risks attached to each of those diets, and they published it in a study. And this is the study that the media picked up on and really sensationalized, and that's the study that I reflected on for Kidopedia readers.
Awesome. So, what are some of those key findings from this study? We'd love to know. Now, your article highlights 5 key points. Would you be able to go through them with us now?
Definitely. So the differences actually stood out for the vegan group of children. So the study, the scientists that ran the study were expecting the differences to come through for vegetarian vegan, but in actual fact, the differences really just shone through with the vegan group, and the vegetarian group were actually grouped with the omnivore diets.
Hmm.
And so these differences, as I talked to, the key findings, they actually were different only for the kids on the vegan diet. The first thing they found was that these children had what they refer to as lower cardiovascular risk, which means that basically refers to risk of heart disease. And this in the study was
Wow.
picked up through a blood test that looked at the markers of cholesterol and a couple of different things like that in the blood to pick up on risk there. And it was improved in the vegan group, but it wasn't improved in the vegetarian or omnivore diet group. The second thing that they found was that in these same blood tests, the vegan children were actually at risk of having some low nutrients in there. So at risk of having low vitamin D, B12 and iron in the blood. Interestingly enough, a couple of those actually did carry through the vegetarian children who also had lower levels of B12 and vitamin D. The third thing that came out of this study was that the vegan children had lower bone mineral density, which basically means their bones were a little bit weaker. And this was quite significant. It was a significant difference to the vegetarian and children in the omnivore diet. But not only were their bones weaker, they were also found to be shorter. And the difference in height was actually a bit above 3 centimetres. Interestingly, the vegetarian children were also a little shorter, but they didn't come through as a big enough difference. They thought that difference might be just due to chance, but the vegan group was such a difference in the height that was considered to be a really a significant marker. And the final thing that was noticed in the vegan children was that it had a lower percentage of body fat.
Overall. So just, I guess, summarizing what I'm hearing you saying, and tell me if I've heard correctly. So children raised on a vegan diet, the study showed, may have healthier hearts and less body fat than omnivores, which is, as you stated, people who eat both or a balanced diet with both meat and vegetables. But the children grow up shorter with weaker bones, and which is a direct quote from that recent study, the European study. And the
Correct.
people who followed a plant-based diet or vegan diet were on average 3 centimeters shorter than those who ate meat. I ate meat when I was younger, but I'm still a bit shorter, so I'm not sure what happened there. Maybe it's just the Southern Italian genes that I've got from Sicily. But anyway, we put it to that part of the family. Well, yeah. Anyway, from Calabria and Sicily, so one of them. But anyway, now the study also found that vegan children had 4 to 6% less bone mineral content and were overall 3 times more likely to be deficient in vitamin B12 than the omnivores. So is that what you're saying? The overall, okay. Now
Yep.
so there's a couple other things that you mentioned, which I just wanted to touch on too, because I drink soy milk, and you mentioned in the first point of your article also that breast milk should be the sole food for the first 4 to 6 months of the infant's life, and there are I guess soy-based alternatives with infant formula as well. Now, my understanding is that soy is actually quite high in calcium. So, but there was a relation with the bone density as well. So, is there a direct correlation there, or like what are your thoughts with that?
So soy products in Australia, what they refer to as soy milk or soy infant formulas, won't naturally have calcium in there, but they are almost all brands in Australia will actually add calcium to these products. And there's also naturally high levels of protein in them. So you do tend to find that the soy replacements are actually nutritionally look pretty good when you compare it to dairy products. So when you take dairy out but you replace with soy, you're replacing with a soy product that's been calcium fortified. You're actually replacing with something that's got a pretty good looking nutrition profile to come back in. So if you can't breastfeed your infant and looking for an alternative to a milk-based formula, then soy-based formulas are an appropriate option to make. Soy milk itself shouldn't be used for infants, just while we're on the topic, until they're after 1. It shouldn't be the sole source of diet, but soy formula is okay.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. So overall, then, what should parents make of the findings then?
To be honest, Not that much in isolation. This was a really nice article to get some clicks and to really sort of get some drama and hysteria around it, because the children came up much shorter. But there are some issues with this study that mean that we can't suddenly change what we do. We can't suddenly go, oh, don't be vegan or don't be omnivore. It's a study that really adds to the pool of information that we know already. As I mentioned, it helped us out with an age group that we don't know much about yet, that the 5 to 10-year-olds, or that sort of that middle group of children. So it was helpful in some ways, but it was actually a really small study. The number of children that they had on the vegan diet was only 52. And that's not a big number to suddenly, make a big change to the kids in Australia. It was also in a small group of white children only in Poland. And we also don't know from the results that they came through with this, we actually don't know too much about what it actually means. We don't know if the children are shorter at 10, but do a bit of catch-up growth and they're, similar heights by 18. We
Right.
don't know whether the cardiac profile that we saw in these children was actually carried through to meaning actually anything at all into adulthood. So we're sort of inferring a lot. So parents, listening to this information, I think it can point out to us that there are risks when you do take food groups out of the diet, and that's really relevant and really important to address. And there are health benefits of more unprocessed and plant-based eating. However, it's not a cause for a big change in practice at this point in time.
Now, the authors also said that vegan children should be given vitamins, which you alluded to earlier on in the interview, in the chat, in particular vitamin B12 and vitamin D supplements to reduce the potential long-term health consequences of being raised on a plant-based diet. What are your thoughts of that?
It's really important, actually. The B12, one of the ones you mentioned, is something that is actually not possible to get on the vegan diet. B12 is a nutrient that you get from animal products. So when you take all animal products out of the diet, you actually take out the B12 sources, which means you actually need supplementation to get B12 in the diet. And in this study, we saw that kids who did have B12 supplementation, which was actually about 2/3 of the children, they were actually able to get their B12 levels to be high enough. Now, an alternative to supplementation is something we call fortification, and that basically means that the B12 is added to a food product instead of being taken as a supplement, and either one actually work quite well.
That's good to know then. Well, if I guess parents want to sort of raise their children on a vegan diet, what should they actually be aware of?
The key thing with the vegan eating is that what we would refer to as the protein sources, that they're replaced with really high quality proteins, and that's really critical. That's what we seems to come through in this particular study, as well as studies that we know that have been previously done. And what I mean by that is that children on a vegan diet will have plenty of these particular foods in their diet, and they are nuts, seeds, and legumes, which are products like beans, lentils, chickpeas. And that group includes soybeans, and there are a lot of soy products these days. So things like tofu and soy, other products made from soy.
So overall, then, how would you say that children sort of can and should thrive on a vegan diet? No doubt this requires a lot of planning. I think for parents, would
That's
you
such a
say?
good point. It really does. It's certainly possible to thrive on a vegan diet. I want to reinforce that it is possible. It is
Yep.
possible to reduce nutrition risk on the vegan diet, but it does have to have those products, and it's actually quite hard to do that. So your point to say a lot of planning, that is really important. It will also have to require some supplementation. For example, the B12 we spoke to, which is you need to add to the vegan diet somehow, but also probably some other supplementation, things like the vitamin D, the iron, potentially things like omega-3 and zinc. And so on the vegan diet, I actually think it is really helpful to get some professional advice, because there is so much risk attached to it alongside the potential benefit from it. And so having some professional advice about making sure there's enough of the good proteins in there, as well as the right supplementation for your child, is pretty important.
Now, do you think, Sarah, that the more we have access to information and advice as to how we can eat healthily on a plant-based diet and have our children and infants also eat and grow healthily on a plant-based diet, the more people would be likely to give it a go, do you think?
question. I think so. I think people respond really well to new information. Human beings, we seem to be very curious and keen to sort of explore and find out new information. So the more that these approaches are out there and people feel supported in that approach, I think it will increase in incidence. And I think things like the sustainable planet, the animal welfare, potential health benefits, I think they're on people's radar at the moment. So I think it is something that will increase in popularity.
Here's hoping, like, I guess that there's more research in particular on this topic to help really maximize the health benefits of plant-based diet in children. But in the meantime, of course, and in closing, if a parent wanted to move to a plant-based diet, however, are concerned about the risks, what advice would you offer, and where would they start then?
Mm. Good question. There are resources out there, and they're in the. I can give them to the links to Kitapedia and in the article. But I think professional advice is really important. I think the risks are significant. The potential for a child to be a lot shorter, as I said, we don't know what to make of it, but things like that are actually really important because that in itself is associated with health outcomes. So minimizing the risk and getting the benefit is finding a balance between those two is really important, and really for vegan children requires professional support. And that can be through a pediatric dietitian like myself. It might be through a pediatrician. There's a couple of different sources. And as I said, there are resources out there, places like Dietitians Australia or the Better Health Channel. They're two sites that have really got a nice, broad and appropriate information.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, the article that we're speaking about today has beautifully broken down a lot of this information, which will, of course, have a link in the show notes, and some of the other points, which we'll leave the viewers and the listeners to read in their own time. But some of the other points you make in the article, of course, is that nutritional risk is relevant to vegan eating, but it's also relevant for any infant that avoids a whole food group. So as you mentioned that earlier on, you make another point about the nutrition risk in the study were relevant to vegan diets and relevant, but less so to vegetarian diets, which I found quite interesting. Is that because of the dairy generally, do you find?
Yeah, it is. The big difference is the dairy products and also eggs. That's another protein source that's in the vegetarian diet that provides a whole lot of quality proteins. And in this particular study, the dairy actually meant that the vegetarians actually had the highest calcium intake. So that sort of including that made a big difference to the calcium intake of those children, and that led to the strengthening of the bones because calcium is related to bone strength.
And another point you make in the article, the behavior associated with improved health profiles in the study appeared to be for children who ate less processed foods, irrespective of the
Mm.
type of diet. So can you maybe just touch on that just really briefly?
That's the question is, if you go towards plant-based eating, where does actually the benefit come from? And this study indicated that it wasn't the fact that meat was taken out that gave the benefit. It was the fact that there was less processed food in the diet, and that seemed to be more linked to the benefit. So if you're looking to use this kind of information to get more health benefit for your child, then the outcome is actually to increase the use of unprocessed foods as opposed to taking meat out.
And as you just stated before, the study does give us some great information, but it doesn't tell us everything. So, of course, as you stated earlier, if parents really are curious or wanting to reduce the amount of meat in their diet, but wanting to supplement that with other proteins, it does require a little bit of planning, a bit of research. So it's about understanding what it means for your own child, and we'll have those other links in the show notes, of course. But I guess if you were to summarize the key messages today for anyone watching and listening, what would they be?
Parents should feel supported in whichever approach they use to feed their child, that whether it's vegan, vegetarian, or an omnivore mixed diet that includes meats, they're all really appropriate options for children and can all be done without risk. However, knowing the risks and being able to address them is the key part. So particularly a diet that might take out food groups, knowing the nutrition risk with that and how to replace it is really important.
Thank you for sharing that. And of course, if parents have got any questions for you personally and or would like to get in touch with you, whereabouts can they find you?
I've got a website, www.baysidedietetics.com.au. I'm also on Facebook under Bayside Dietetics.
Sarah, as always, an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Great to catch up, and thank you for sharing your expertise on this particular topic. It's been really fascinating and very, very interesting. So thank you so much. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Really enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye.